Welcome, everyone. So glad you're here for this presentation. It's called A Unique Approach to Preventing Burnout. And I'll tell you why in just a moment. I do want to let you know that I'm recording this. And if you have any comments or questions, you can enter them in the Q&A box. So let's get started. So I'm just going to start with a quick introduction. My name is Kim Christensen. I'm a productivity coach. I help busy professionals who want to become more strategic with their time so that they can create a life that they love. And for those of you who are in the membership already, and if you want more information on the membership, you can go to my website, financialwellnesscoach.ca. But for those of you who are already in the membership and you would like some more information on this topic, I'm going to save this presentation as well as all the supporting materials under Module 6, Mindset and Emotional Literacy. We're going to cover that quite extensively today. If you want more materials, you can go there. We're also going to touch on creating a self-care habit. So you can find more information about that in Module 5, Systems and Habits. And although we're not going to talk about it in much detail today, you can find more information on creating engagement and follow-through in Module 4, the follow-through module. And like I said, if you're not yet in the membership, and you would like some more information about that, you can find it on my website at financialwellnesscoach.ca. All right, welcome everyone. So if you're here, you're interested in the topic of preventing burnout. And I thought what I'd do is I'd share with you my own experience with burnout in case it's helpful. So I was a self-proclaimed stress bunny for much of my career. I became an accountant in 2003, and I spent a lot of time in audit, public accounting, reporting, management reporting, even some data analysis and some tax, until I arrived at finance operations, and I took a management position, and I was there for about 10 years in finance operations, leading a team there. Loved it. I loved my accounting experience, and I loved working with people and numbers and telling all of the numerical story there. And I always seem to operate at a better, or at least this is the story that I told myself, on a certain level of stress, until I was so stressed out that someone said to me, they said, you remind me of a stress bunny. And at the time, I thought that was kind of ridiculous. And I also remember thinking that people needed to operate at a certain level of urgency in order to get things done. That is until 2017, when I experienced a work-related burnout. I now see in hindsight that some stress can be productive, absolutely. However, there's a limit, a threshold to the amount of stress that can make us productive. And for each individual, I think it's a bit unique, but if for myself, I didn't even recognize that I was approaching burnout until I was in burnout. So I want to share with you some of the warning signs that I saw in hindsight, so that if you feel like you're approaching burnout, that you can recognize it and prevent it early on. First of all, I'll start with a definition of burnout. The classic definition of burnout is the 3 E's: low engagement, low efficacy, and low energy. And so the way that I knew that I was in burnout was that low engagement for me looked like I stopped caring as much about my work. In fact, I got to a point where I started to dread going to work. which was unusual for me because prior to that, I had enjoyed my work quite a bit. Low efficacy, that means that I felt like the things that I were doing weren't moving the needle. I felt like I was one step forward and two steps back, if any steps forward at all. And low energy eventually looked like emotional exhaustion for me. I felt tired, chronically tired. I was managing my energy with food and coffee, junk food, sugar throughout the day. And then at the end of the day, I was relaxing with a glass of wine and checking out with some Netflix just in order to kind of manage that energy. And I was finding that my stress was interrupting my sleep, as was my habit of sugar and caffeine and alcohol to manage all of that. It was interfering with my sleep. So it got into a bit of a self-perpetuating cycle where I was tired all of the time. And then I became sleep deprived as well. So the classic definition of burnout is low engagement, low efficacy, and low energy. Some further information on what that looked like leading up to the burnout experience that I had. Some of those warning signs was that I had a declining interest in work. Like I said, I had normally been someone who looked forward to my work, and I started to dread coming to work. I started fantasizing about getting another job. I would think about like taking a demotion or even a lateral position that didn't really have some of the responsibilities that my current position had, so that telling myself that I needed a break from all of the stress and the responsibility. I even remember thinking one time I had a minor flu bug and I took a sick day, which was unusual for me. And I was thinking, I was just thankful for the day off work. It took a sick day to actually take a break. And I always was thinking that I would relax and I would find relief when I got to the weekend or to a vacation. But the interesting thing about that particular mindset is that coming back to work after the weekend or after a vacation, it would just all come flooding back. Low efficacy, what that meant or looked like for me was feeling like I didn't have a lot of choice, feeling like chronically frustrated, and feeling like I was always trying to catch up. Specifically, I remember a situation, it was a Monday morning and I came into the office. This is back when we were working in the office in 2017, and sat down at my computer, fired it up, and the unread emails in my email inbox numbered in the dozens, if not hundreds. And I felt like it was Monday morning and I was starting off my week already behind. Like there was just no feeling like I could get caught up. And then the emotional exhaustion, what that looked like for me in hindsight is that I was, for weeks leading up to the burnout, I was on the edge of tears all the time. And it was interesting because someone would ask me how I was doing, and I would feel like crying in that moment, even though the conversation was really innocuous. It was just a normal conversation. So I felt like I was always on the verge of tears. I also felt like that stress bunny state where everything was really urgent, everything was really important, and feeling like I was always behind. So if any of those symptoms are resonating with you, what I'll encourage you to do is take a look at the overlap between burnout and other conditions. Because burnout can look like other things like depression or anxiety or grief or even repressed rage. It can look like a lot of different things. It's always great to check in with your healthcare practitioner just to make sure and rule out any of those other conditions. You'll know it's something more if you're struggling to get out of bed and just get the basics done. With burnout, you're still going to work, but you're struggling to get caught up, and you're fantasizing about a different job. Okay, I'm going to talk about 2 strategies to manage and prevent burnout. And those 2 strategies both revolve around energy. So the first one is discharging the stress energy, and the other one is banking and increasing productive energy. So we'll start with decreasing or discharging the stress energy. All right. And I will keep an eye on the Q&A box if you have any comments or questions while we're going along. And I'll also reserve some time at the end for questions too. So what do I mean by the stress cycle? This is a concept that I borrowed from Dr. Emily Nagoski. If you're interested in reading more about it, she's written a book. It's called Burnout: The Secret to Unlocking the Stress Cycle. I found this concept really, really helpful in terms of understanding where I was at with discharging the stress energy. So what we know about stress is that it's typically characterized as the fight or flight response. And the fight or flight response is typically triggered when we perceive a threat in our environment. So there's a threat, and then we have that fight or flight response. The fight or flight response can be a physiological response where your heart rate goes up, your vision constricts, and you're feeling that sort of stress energy that's priming you for taking action, that adrenaline rush. It can also be a mental response where your thoughts start racing and you start looking for opportunities to take action. And then it can also be an emotional response. So it can feel like fear or anger. So all of those things, all of those responses that are encompassed in the fight or flight response prime us to take action. The thing that's not, or that at least I didn't really understand well until I read Dr. Nagoski's book, is that the fight or flight response is the energy that's created by that is discharged through action. And then there's also a completion phase as well. And the example she uses is back in the day when we were in the hunting and gathering mode of our evolution. We would see a threat in the forest, a bear or a wild animal of some sort, that would trigger the fight or flight response. We would take action. Either we would fight or we would escape. And that action then had a resolution to it, whereby we escaped the threat or we killed the threat, and there was some sort of closure to that stress cycle. The interesting thing now is that we may or may not take action. So as an example, my morning commute used to be really, really stressful for me. And what I noticed during that morning commute now is that there was no resolution to that because there was no action that I could take as a result. I just had to sort of get through it, white knuckle it through my morning commute until I got to work. And then, so there was no action to release that stress energy. And then there was no resolution to it either. So much so that I felt like my fight or flight response had got stuck in the on position. So everything became a threat, and I was constantly taking action. And I call that action like the freezer frantic. You know, when you're feeling like really out of control and you take frantic action to get control over it. What I now realize is that's because there was no resolution to those specific stress cycles. And so I want to spend a little bit of time right now talking about how we can discharge some of that stress energy through either action or completion. Okay, so what does that look like in practice? Discharging the stress energy. Well, it can be movement of two forms. One is a physical movement and one is an emotional movement. So a physical movement, if we take the example of the morning commute, physical discharging of the energy, and this is the example that Dr. Nagoski uses, would be getting out of your car and doing 10 jumping jacks. That gives you a way to take action and then close the stress cycle through that physical movement. The other type of movement that I find really interesting and effective is emotional movement. And borrowing from an analogy from Dr. Nagoski, she describes emotions as tunnels. And so if emotions are tunnels, what that's meant to suggest is that we can move towards the tunnel and move through it in order to discharge some of that stress energy. Such an interesting idea, because back in the day, I didn't have time for emotions. I didn't see emotions as signals, first of all. And I also thought that I just needed to put my head down, get to work, get busy, and power through it was my MO, basically. And now when I use emotional movement to work through the emotions, it allows me to discharge some of that stress energy that's building up as a result of having this fight or flight response constantly triggered. Okay, so in order to move through the emotional tunnel, the first thing that I did was I recognized that emotions are signals. I've now got this image in my brain of a dashboard, basically. And like your car dashboard, there's different monitors, different signals there that alert me to when my fuel, my reserves are getting low. This helps me to remember that emotions are just signals. They're just identifying a need that I have in that moment. So when an emotional response comes up and I recognize it, I am then able to turn towards that emotion and address it rather than power through it. So once we recognize that the emotion is a signal identifying a need, then we can turn toward the emotion. My original instinct was to ignore it and keep going, or turn away from it, ignore it, just keep going. Don't show any emotion. Emotions are, at best, they're a distraction. At worst, in my mind, they were a weakness. And so I would either ignore it or turn away from it. Now, my practice is to turn toward the emotion. And so you're probably familiar with this strategy, name it to tame it. So what does turning toward the emotion look like? The first step is just to identify what the feeling is. And for someone like me who's in the habit of ignoring it, coaching was really, really helpful for me. I was able to identify it. So something other than just stressed out. I was able to put a name to the feeling. And then I was able to articulate it and give a voice towards it. So that helped me to move towards it rather than to resist it or just power through it. The other thing that coaching has really helped me with is to plan a response to the emotion. So knowing that it's a signal and it's identifying a need, now I can plan an action in response to that that is productive for me rather than blocks me or has me stuck in the stress cycle. I'll give you an example of what that looks like. So anger is a great example. Before, I would recognize when I was feeling angry, but I think subconsciously I felt like I wasn't allowed to be angry, or it was just a distraction for me. So I would push it down. And then what happens is when I was pushing down the anger, I would find that it would come out in unproductive ways. It would fuel me towards actions that weren't productive for me. I would yell, I would bury it, I would stress eat, I would check out through social media, whatever that looked like. Now I recognize the anger and I use it as a cue for self-compassion. And I'm not always able to recognize it right away, especially when it's really fresh for me. But again, this is where I work with my coach to identify those feelings, work through them, process them, and then plan strategic action that allows me to move through that tunnel instead of get blocked in it. The other thing about emotions is that they identify needs. And if they are just a signal, they're like a dashboard, they're very neutral, and they're just alerting us to a particular need. I use that as a signal or a cue to ask myself what it is that I need in that moment. Recognizing what I need, I can then give that to myself. I don't have to wait for someone else to recognize what I need and for someone else to give that to me. I can create it for myself in that moment. Some of the things that I have recognized now is the feeling of stressed out, as an example. That can signal to me that I need more physical movement, kind of that physical discharge of energy that I was talking about earlier. So I'll go for a walk, or I'll go outside, move around a bit, or I'll even just stand up from my desk and do some stretching. The feeling of exhausted signals to me that I just need some sleep, basically. The feeling of frustrated can help me to identify when I need some self-compassion. And the feeling of sad, as an example, can signal to me where I need some support. I remember my coach once telling me that when she felt sad or low, or like she was dealing with haters, she would reach out to her network and she would just ask them to send her a message of love and kindness. And I thought, oh, what a great idea to identify what we need in that moment and to reach out and ask for it. I thought that was brilliant. And I've used that myself on occasion. Okay, so we've talked about discharging the stress energy and the two types of movement that can help us discharge that stress energy are physical movement and emotional movement. Now, what I'd like to talk about is creating a bank of productive energy. And so this is some of those self-care habits that I'm going to talk about those more in I'm doing another webinar next week around developing self-care habits, but I want to talk a little bit about it today as well in terms of the idea of banking our energy. I almost have this visual in my head where there is a conceptual bank of energy, and when we need it, when our reserves are getting low, when we're getting stressed out, we draw out of that bank, we make withdrawals. And burnout is effectively making withdrawals on an empty bank, basically. And the way that we increase that bank of productive energy is by putting in deposits. So there are different ways that we can put deposits into the energy bank. And I'm sure these are not unfamiliar to you. Getting proper sleep, eating food for fuel are some of them. I think that exercise is something that I maybe didn't understand I understood that conceptually exercise was good for my body, was good for my physical health. It was even good for my mental health. But now what I recognize is that exercise, that physical movement on a daily basis creates this bank of productive energy for me that I can draw upon even when I'm not feeling stressed. It creates that reserve, that mental energy. And so, as a practice, I like to move my body at least once a day and preferably outdoors as well. And then the other one that is, we know in theory, but we don't necessarily, we forget about in practice, is developing a support network. So, reaching out, cultivating those connections, and cultivating a connection with ourselves. This is something that I've really experienced through coaching, is a better awareness of what it is that I want and need, and giving me the resources and tools to respond to that. I think of that as that developing that connection with myself as well as with others. All of that bank of energy helps me to show up in ways that are very intentional, show up as my best self. They can also help me to understand better contextually when my reserves are getting low, because now I have a better sense of what it looks like for me to have sufficient energy and what it looks like for me when those energy reserves are getting low. I can tell when those are getting low. I'm more tuned in to what that energy bank looks like. If this is resonating with you and you'd like some more information, I'll invite you to check out my website, financialwellnesscoach.ca. I've got all kinds of resources on there, and I will put the link to this webinar on my website as well. The other thing that I have on my website is a peaceful productivity assessment. If you just go to the homepage and check out the assessment, there's a really quick questionnaire there that you can fill out just to have a better understanding of where you're at in terms of creating peaceful productivity. If you include your email address, I will send you a customized strategy and give you some of those tools that can help you to shift out of that stress cycle and move more into a peaceful productivity state. Okay, that's what I have for you today. Let me know if you have any questions in the Q&A box.